Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leandra Chikoros, and I am the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Administrator in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. April is Autism Acceptance Month, and we wanted to take the time to discuss support for adults with autism and how to navigate assistance, as well as support for caregivers. I would like to take the time to thank Commissioner John O'Grady, Commissioner Kevin Boyce, and Commissioner Erica Crawley, as well as our County Administrator, Kenneth Wilson, for their continuous support. I have the great pleasure of introducing Kathi Machle, Managing Director of Autism Society, Central Ohio, and Alex Corwin, Program Director at the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, which is also known as OCALI, Lifespan Transition Center. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. If we could please begin, we have a wonderful presentation that Kathi will go ahead and begin.
Well, good afternoon. As Leandra said, I'm Kathi Machle. I'm with the Autism Society Central Ohio. And I just wanted to start out with a quote from Dr. Stephen Shore, who himself has been diagnosed with autism. And that is, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that really leads to one of the difficulties we have is everyone on the spectrum is different, has different needs. So please take what we have to share today as ideas and suggestions. Not everyone with autism needs this or is like this. So April is Autism Acceptance Month. It used to be called Autism Awareness Month. Basically, the change is moving from the idea that people know you have autism to the idea that people accept you despite or because of your autism, and that we celebrate the differences. It's a much more active interaction that we're aiming for. So what is autism? It's a neurological disorder. It can result from a brain abnormality and most likely has some genetic or causes or a predisposition. Some have connected it to vaccines, but the science just isn't there. Although autism is linked to certain diseases and viral infections. Within the last couple of weeks, the CDC updated the prevalence to 1 in 36 children. It still is more boys than girls. And just as a remember, people with autism are not necessarily below average in IQs. Oftentimes you have somebody who's nonverbal and is brilliant, but is so locked in by the disability that they can't express that. And so what does autism look like? Difficulties in communication, difficulties with social interaction, repetitive or restrictive behavior. You might see them pacing or flapping their hands, or, as much as just being absolutely unable to have a paperclip in their vicinity without bending it. Sensory issues and difficulties with executive function. Executive function are those sort of learned abilities to do things like organize, working memory, prioritize tasks. Well, I have a slide later that talks about that a little more. But just remembering that 90% of communication is nonverbal, and the nonverbal areas are the places where folks with autism tend to have the most trouble. So they're not picking up on your nonverbal cues. And these communication difficulties can lead to social stigma. Folks may regard them as rude or weird. But you have to remember that people with autism are sort of navigating a world where they don't speak the same language and they don't understand the rules that everyone operates by. If most autism is diagnosed in childhood. And a lot of times people who are undiagnosed spend their lives going, what is wrong with me? Why don't I get these things that everyone else seems to be getting? I feel like I'm from another planet. Getting a diagnosis as an adult, and a lot of adults are being diagnosed now, can sort of be a relief. It explains things about yourself. It helps with self-knowledge. And it also may help focus in on where to go to get assistance. There are executive functioning coaches. If you know that that's your difficulty and you can name it, you can go find one and get help with that. Occupational therapy can help with sensory issues. Support groups, just as a place to go and find out that you are not alone. So getting a diagnosis as an adult starts by just going to your primary care practitioner and say, hey, I'm wondering about this. Can you give me a referral? And you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. We can provide you, and Callie can provide you with the names of folks that we're comfortable doing this. And there are a lot of adults out there who are self-diagnosed from questionnaires on the internet. And this may be a reasonable place to start if you have suspicions, but we as the Autism Society don't recommend that as the final diagnostic step, because there are possible medical and psychological conditions that actually may ape autism, but it would be dangerous to miss those. When a professional diagnosis is made, the report usually comes with recommendations and referrals for therapies. Again, as I said, things like executive function coaching, social groups, that's kind of where I go with the diagnosis of adult. But here is sort of a diagram of what autism spectrum disorder looks like by an adult with autism. And the whole thing that I love about this is it's not a linear spectrum. The pie charts show that everyone has strengths and weaknesses. So, the person whose pie chart is on the right is pretty strong on social skills, but needs a lot of support on sensory issues. So if you look at the individual and look at the support and weaknesses, then you kind of know where you can help.
Kathi, I've not seen that spectrum slide before, that visual. That's wonderful. I think.
Yeah, I think it's about the best one I've ever seen.
Yeah, and if folks have ever taken any of those kind of personality assessments or leaderships, like a DISC profile or something like that, this mirrors that almost identically, right? Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses for communication and strategic planning and math, even, and socialization. So I think this really helps normalize that folks on the autism spectrum just have varying abilities and barriers, just like we all do.
Right. And I always like to say it's a difference in degree, not kind. We all have, I, for one, hate being in crowded places, maybe to the point of being pathological, but I don't have a diagnosis of autism, although I share that characteristic with many people with autism. So.
Yeah. And hey, I love my routines, right? I gotta have coffee every morning and, get settled in before I can really be able to kind of tackle the day. So this is wonderful. I'm gonna have to steal this one.
Oh, you're welcome. So the communication challenges can go from being nonverbal just to having sort of abnormal speech patterns. One pretty common symptom is the literal interpretation of language. Idioms are really, really hard. we always, talk about, when at one point I said it's raining cats and dogs, and my son looked out the window and said, no, it isn't. So that's something to remember. Also, many folks with autism avoid eye contact. And it used to be that was one of the first things speech therapists dealt with children, is look at my eyes. And as we've gotten to know autism better, and talk to adults who can communicate about what the eye contact issue is, sometimes it's just so painful to look in someone's eyes, or it's so distracting from paying attention to what's going in the conversation. So remember, if someone's not making eye contact, it's probably not because they're lying to you or they're not being respectful. It's just a feature of autism for some folks. And the other thing to remember is that in times of stress, someone with autism may be less able to communicate than they are at other times. So again, social challenges, not picking up social cues, nonverbal language. They can seem rigid, as Alex pointed out. He likes his routines. People with autism tend to like their routines. They may have difficulty with abstract thinking, and may be hyper-focused on certain objects or subjects. If that happens to coincide with what's going on in school or work, it's fabulous. But it can get in the way of other things. Okay, so this is I'm going to introduce you to Daniel. These videos from Britain are among my favorite. So we're going to talk about social challenges by watching him.
Can you tell me how to get to Restoration Unit 3C? I have to report to Jeffrey Fox. Can you tell me how to get to Restoration Unit 3C? I have to report to Jeffrey Fox here.
Come on then, I'll show you. It's this way. This place is a maze, which means I have to show people around all the time.
My name's Daniel Davidson. What's yours? My name's Daniel Davidson. What's yours?
Follow me through here. I'm sure you've been here before as a visitor, but nothing prepares you for the true size of it. I mean, I've been working here about 3 years and I still get lost, so don't worry. It's only your first day, so if you find yourself wandering around and not exactly sure where you're going, there are phones on every level, so you can always buzz reception and I'll let you know where to go. Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?
Trying to get your name.
Sure you were. Pervert.
Okay, so there you saw somebody who doesn't know the social rules. A lot of my friends with autism will greet the clerk in Kroger by their name every time because they read the name tags. And they remember everybody's names. It's important. So, if you were processing this with Daniel after the event, he probably doesn't know why she got upset with him. And, he may well be very upset about the fact she yelled at him and he doesn't understand what was going on. So I would, try to allow him time to calm down and tell his side of the story, maybe in writing, before we take this to HR and have have him fired for harassing this girl. My inclination would also be to talk to her about where she puts her name tag, but that's my own, that my age is showing on that one probably. So folks with autism also tend to have sensory challenges. We experience the world through our sense of touch and hearing and eyesight. And if your brain processes the information coming in through the senses differently, it can lead to all sorts of problems just functioning in the world. If you're hypersensitive to sound or light, that may impinge on your ability to function in the realms that you need to function. Folks with autism may not like to be touched, or they may crave firm touch. I spent countless hours looking for underwear that did not have labels in it when my son, who's in his 30s, was young, because he couldn't handle the labels. You know, it took a long time before they were printing them directly on the underwear. They may have extreme food preferences and aversions. They may have anxiety about things other people enjoy. A lot of our folks are afraid of dogs, but you know, that's a hard thing in our society, where people love their dogs and they want to take them everywhere. They may also have balance and spatial awareness issues. So that can, you know, be problematic. So this is, I may be out of order here, I'm sorry, yeah. Well, no, here's Daniel in a sensory situation.
Have you called an ambulance?
Can you hear me?
I need an ambulance now.
Open your eyes. Wake up. Are you hurt? Are you hurt?
Where are you going?
So what I like about that video is that Daniel is so overwhelmed by the sensory input he's getting from that accident that he can't figure out a plan to act in the way that we think would be appropriate. So. Oh, sorry, that was not what I wanted to do. So the other thing I mentioned is that executive function can be problematic. And as I said, these are learned abilities: time management, organization, prioritizing, working memory, thinking about problem solving and self-reflection, the ability to start and switch tasks. Transitions can be really, really hard for folks with autism. Self-regulation, adapting to change, and maintaining focus on a task. So those can be challenges for adults with autism. And then, you know, the thing, stress and anxiety can impair, as well as sensory issues, as we saw with that last video. They can impair executive function and learning. So. Then we always say autism seldom walks alone. Folks with autism often have trouble sleeping. They often have gastrointestinal issues. A huge number of folks with autism have anxiety, and their rigidity and love of routine sometimes can look like OCD or be OCD. So just what can we do to support model tolerance and educate other employees on how to interact with those with autism? Make sure everybody in the office in your situation understands that if you're making accommodations for a person with autism, there is a reason for those accommodations. Provide an avenue for resolving miscommunication so that everyone feels heard. And, just as a couple of examples, I recently had an adult tell me that she was in a, every morning they had an office meeting. And she was a little late one day, and the chair she usually sits in had been taken by someone else. And what she said was, I sat in another chair and I just couldn't get my mind off. I'm not sitting in the right place enough to listen to what was going on in the office meeting. So, if you have an accommodation where you save that chair for Joe every day, that's not a bad accommodation, and just let folks know. So, helpful hints. Try not to rely on your own emotional reaction to when something happens, but look for, sensory causes and try to help. Some folks with autism have a real problem with receptive language, and it may take them extra time to process. So if you ask them a question, wait a good amount of time for the answer, because if you ask it again, you're just starting the process of trying to get the response over. We usually do it, say, leave at least 30 seconds. And in a conversation, 30 seconds seems interminable. We already talked about idioms. Help foster social interactions. A person with autism may just need an invitation to join in. Think about a buddy system. Be clear about what's going to happen, what is expected in job performance, and provide structure. The other thing is provide frequent and direct feedback. Don't let something go on, for very long. Provide clear step-by-step guidance for how to improve or how to do it differently. So that's kind of, this is just another slide with that kind of suggestions. Allowing noise canceling headphones or sunglasses in the workplace, things like that. Those are easy accommodations that can make a huge amount of difference to someone with sensory issues. So that's my thumbnail for you. So now we can get on to the questions and the other anything else that you might want to discuss.
You covered a good bit of that, Kathi. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful information, and we will be sure to post this information in the comments section. Those charts are absolutely amazing. I have not seen those either. So it's just really wonderful to see that and provide additional information. If I could please, one of the things you touched on earlier on how employers can support those with autism. And we talked about employee training, but are there additional resources for professionals and families where perhaps they could receive services that help improve their performance within the workplace?
Yeah, every state here in the United States has a vocational rehabilitation agency, and here in Ohio, it's called Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which is often called OOD. They have vocational counselors that can kind of develop a plan with a job seeker, a person with autism or a disability, help them with some career exploration opportunities, some job coaching or some supports on the job as they learn it, and then that job coach fades out. This is a wonderful support for the family too, to have another kind of person on the team to help with planning and scheduling and supporting that person as they look for a job and find different accommodations or different supports, whether it's visual supports or sensory, navigating a sensory environment. That counselor is usually very helpful in negotiating with the employer as well as the provider that's providing those services. And then OOD also has kind of a toolkit of resources for employers too. They have business engagement specialists around the state that will do trainings for employers to talk a little bit more about having a more diverse and accommodating workspace, helping coworkers understand kind of their role in naturally supporting somebody that might be hired that has a disability. So a lot of really great resources through opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities for the job seeker and their family, but also for employers around the state. So helping connect them with, potential candidates for jobs even, and participating in some of these job fairs. Here in Ohio, we're really lucky because OOD does do quite a bit for everybody involved in the job searching process.
Well, I will say that Autism Society Central Ohio and our sister organizations around the state do provide caregiver and parent support groups that sometimes just talking to somebody who's walking the same walk, who's been in the same shoes and has come up with creative solutions can really help.
Thank you so much, especially for pointing that out for caregivers. It's a lot involved to care for loved ones with autism, specifically those that are nonverbal and need extra assistance and care. I noticed on one of your slides, it was mentioned that the term high functioning or low functioning are harmful, and really wanting to emphasize being intentional with language and ensure that we're building inclusive environments. Could you please touch on that for a moment?
Well, I think sometimes, that my son is high functioning or this person is high functioning does that person a disservice because it implies they don't really need supports, and it fails to kind of acknowledge that they have weaknesses that do need supports. And, sort of on the other side, somebody who's low functioning, it sort of implies that they don't have value, that they're never going to get better, that they don't have talents that are important to nurture. So, they have autism, and it really is, they may need lots and lots of support with the activities of daily living, but they may be an incredible musician. So, I just think that that tends to build barriers within the autism community and preconceptions within the community at large.
Yeah, I think Kathi nailed that answer. I think knowing that everybody who has a disability or has autism has value, has strengths, has interests, has something to contribute, and it's really kind of incumbent upon us as professionals and families and caregivers to identify the supports that they need in order to find their voice, to participate in activities of their choice and with family gatherings and other things. So I know at Ocali we have kind of a whole suite of online resources at the Autism Certification Center and the Autism Internet modules to really help, whether it's an education team like an IEP team or a family or anybody else that might be supporting an individual on the spectrum, to just find and leverage those strengths and passions and help build on kind of their can-do skills instead of focusing more on the barriers. And that's really where the pivot from like autism awareness to Autism Acceptance Month came from, right? It's like everybody has their own passions and talents, and it's just trying to accept people for who they are and not by a diagnosis or by their limitations.
Yes, thank you so much for pointing that out. And I definitely want to highlight, if I could please, caregivers. It could be a lot to care for a loved one with autism as adults. And I've often heard the phrase, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
So in addition to the resources like the peer support groups, Are there anything additional that we can do to really emphasize that? Because it can be difficult when you receive the negativity from the community, maybe with the outbursts and stares and those that don't understand.
And, you know, you pointed out probably one of my greatest frustrations with the system as it works now is many times we have folks that are caring for it, particularly for adults that have greater challenges, who are just exhausted and they're aging out and they don't really have the supports they need to provide for their loved one in the event that something happens. There are some of the, there are Medicaid waivers, and if you happen to have one, there will be county supports that may step in, but they're not totally adequate. And there's a real scarcity of qualified help right now. So, we do have caregivers who are exhausted and, need some respite. And that's a place where I think our system could be improved. So.
Yeah, I think Kathi touched on the support system in Ohio would be the local county boards of developmental disabilities, which not all people on the spectrum qualify for based off of their needs and their support. But that usually is a really good first place to start because they're a little more comprehensive. I had mentioned opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities earlier, and their focus is employment, like employment and community and competitive employment. Whereas the county board may have some other partnerships, has the ability to administer and oversee like a Medicaid waiver that could pay for support staff or transportation or even some family support like respite. So and that I would say that's a really key partner for folks as they have that first diagnosis is really trying to find maybe those autism specific groups like Autism Society and others around the state to connect with families of lived experience. You can have someone to kind of walk that journey with, but also to try to connect with someone that's a few years ahead of you that can really speak very clearly and bluntly to, you need to prioritize this and you need to, put some of this other stuff on the back burner.
I'm always amazed when I talk to someone who has a teenager that has never registered with the Board of DD. And to me, that's the first place that you should go, just to get into the system and get the supports.
Yeah, I will say at Ocali, we have our parent guide to autism spectrum, which is a really helpful guide. If you're having that initial first diagnosis, it's a wonderful kind of tool or booklet to read. And then there's also another handout that we have both in English and Spanish on like the basic introduction for families on autism spectrum disorder. So you talked a little bit about just that initial kind of wave or weight that comes with a diagnosis. And those are two good resources to help folks understand some of those next steps or what the initial part of your journey might look like, connecting with the county board and trying to find early intervention and other supports that are proven to be successful. And then another kind of tool that we have on the Ohio Employment First website, which is we focus on employment tools and resources, but there's a tool called the Agency Navigation Tool, and it highlights several different agencies here in Ohio that a youth or a person with autism may be eligible for, Department of Medicaid, Job and Family Services, Social Security, opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities, the County Board of DD. And it gives you a snapshot of all of them and the different services, what the eligibility requirements are, some of their handouts and websites that you can look at. So I would say as well, especially once you get into that transition age at age 14 and above, and even before then, understanding who all of those different partners and agencies are, because when you're in the school system, you have speech and OT and maybe even mental health or behavioral support. You've got teachers that have known you for a long time, building administrators that you've developed great relationships with. And once you exit school, you kind of have to start to build your own team, right? County board, OOD for employment support, Social Security for maybe some income support, Medicaid for health insurance. There's all these different players then that you have to develop a relationship with and maintain eligibility with. So I would really help people focus on just all of the different supports in Ohio, using that agency navigation tool. And then to Kathy's earlier point, connecting with other families, because they'll be able to tell you some tips and tricks with engaging with some of these agencies and what to prioritize, because it is a lot to learn on the fly as you're also trying to support your loved one.
Right.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for pointing that out. And it just is an amazing segue into a question of understanding, yes, it can be difficult to have children diagnosed, but speaking specifically for adults that are diagnosed, I could just imagine how many are actually misdiagnosed and are still trying to grapple with, well, wait a minute, this wasn't ADHD, it was this, or is it a combination? If you don't mind speaking to the resources, I believe earlier was said, starting with your family doctor. But are there additional things that, besides the online quizzes and additional resources that we can turn to, especially in those cases where someone maybe just told, okay, no, this is not what it is, but you just really know it could be.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Kathy, but I feel like we get this call weekly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's a generational thing. I don't know if it was a medical doctor community practice many years ago, right? Just wait and see. We don't want to label anyone early, or even for folks that are much older. Autism not even being on a lot of doctors' radars, right? Like,
when my son was diagnosed in 1995, they thought the prevalence was something over 1 in 500. So it wasn't really on a lot of doctors' radars. Now with the prevalence of 1 in 36, every kid going through the pediatrician is going to be, and has been screened for maybe the last 10 years. But those screening tests weren't, available, and people simply didn't know about it. I will say one thing: if you were misdiagnosed before age 22 and then become diagnosed, there is the possibility you might be eligible for services through the Board of DD, because you have to. It has to have been evident that before age 22 for eligibility for services with the Board of DD. So that might be the bright side to a misdiagnosis. But I think there are a whole lot of folks out there who were diagnosed with ADHD and put on ADHD medications that didn't really help, who are diagnosed with conduct disorders, or not diagnosed with a conduct disorder and just regarded as a bad kid. So, I think, as I said, I think that even a delayed diagnosis of autism can be a very positive thing in self-awareness.
And due to just the number of calls we've gotten in the last couple of years on this topic, we're putting together kind of a sheet of regionally based and psychologists or psychiatrists that can make this diagnosis, that are willing to administer the testing for an adult. Because to Kathy's point, typically a developmental disability, which autism is caught before 22, and there's diagnostic testing, and there's a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists that will do that testing on youth, but the pool of providers for adult testing is much smaller, and not everyone is willing to do it. So that is a resource or a guide that we're going to put out, hopefully sometime this calendar year. We're kind of following up with a lot of physicians that we will refer people to, and just confirming that, we're going to put you on this list. We want to make sure that this is something you're okay with, that you're going to continue to do. because it is a growing need out there for a variety of reasons, right? Whether it's trying to access different supports from these partner agencies that I mentioned earlier, or even talking with your employer about reasonable accommodations and the protections you have through ADA in order to get those to maintain your job and stay employed.
Right.
Thank you. And that, Kathy, I'm so glad you mentioned it, where unfortunately the stigma has been placed where this individual is a bad kid, or it really brings to light justice involved individuals that have autism. Are there resources in place for those that may be incarcerated or facing incarceration? Where, or is that a movement where we need to raise awareness so that becomes a part of the process?
Absolutely. And I think one of the areas where, I think prosecutors' office are becoming more aware of autism and using their discretion a little better, but there's a long way to go on that. I think I can't remember the exact numbers, but statistically, there is a higher rate of autism within the incarcerated population than within the general population. So that tells you, we saw Daniel. I mean, he could have been prosecuted for sexual harassment.
Yeah, I will say currently the governor's office has really invested a lot in what they call like multi-system youth and youth
Right.
that have a disability or a mental health diagnosis or engaged in the criminal justice system, and trying to be more holistic in the approach that we're taking with these youth, so that way they aren't labeled bad kids, but that they get the supports that they need, whether that's counseling and behavior intervention, and just having a wraparound team to support them on their journey, because it can be a lot for families to manage, and it certainly isn't helpful to anyone for some of these folks to simply just be incarcerated. That we really should help people find a path to kind of a meaningful, engaged, and inclusive life in their community.
Yeah. And I said, some of it could be just a lack of knowledge of what the appropriate behavior is. And, I think there are a lot of parents in this country who teach their children, if they're stopped by the police, you put your hands on, keep your hands in plain sight. Yes, sir. No, sir. But I'm not sure we think to train our kids with autism who drive in that. And, it's we have work to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And thinking about one of the things you highlighted, especially in regards to therapies, I've heard the term ABA therapy a lot. If you don't mind educating exactly what is that and what would that look like for an adult?
I'm not sure that ABA therapy is typically provided to adults.
Okay.
ABA therapy was developed, I think, in the 1960s as a way of teaching young children with autism by repetition and how and rewards and consequences, how to navigate social situations, how to navigate functional situations, and when it was first started, basically it was up to age 5 or 6. Now they're extending it further, but in adults, part of that is dealing with brain plasticity and brain development, whether or not it would be scientifically appropriate for a 30-year-old whose brain is largely already developed. I don't know, but we do know with stroke victims that brains can be different parts of the brain can be retrained to do things that have been destroyed by the stroke. So I don't know. I'm not aware of ABA for adults.
Okay.
Yeah, and I will say, so it's applied behavior analysis, which is what ABA stands for. And like any kind of medical treatment or therapy, it just has to be the right fit. It's not going to be something that is just kind of blanket for everyone. It certainly depends on the individual, but also what they're trying to accomplish and what the goals are. And so I would say it's like any other treatment. You want to make sure that you're looking at some of the needs of the participant or the youth, the person with a disability, and what other treatment options might be available. But I think everyone would agree that early intervention and having some sort of therapy and training at a very young age really helps with skill acquisition and developing some of these executive functioning skills and other skills that maybe typical kids develop just through traditional socialization and the education system. But individuals on the spectrum really need intentional training on some of these skills, and that's where ADA and other therapies come into play.
Thank you very much. That is really helpful information, and definitely highlights different paths that adults can look to. Being diagnosed later in life, I would imagine just trying to do a doctor Google search, as I call it, and pulling up all this information. It is overwhelming.
Right.
And it can leave some where possibly with a feeling of defeat and not knowing where to turn. So in addition to your organizations, you mentioned it before, it's almost like a partnership with Department of Developmental Disabilities, and even is it possible to turn into the Social Security Administration? Is that something that is a possibility?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, they're included on that agency navigation tool. And through our center at Ocali, the Lifespan Transition Center, we have a whole library of Take 5 videos, which are short videos that tackle different subjects, which would be kind of applicable to anybody with a disability, but certainly people on the spectrum. And I think we just released a series of 4 or 5 videos on Social Security and just what eligibility is, SSI versus SSDI, and all the different kind of nuances of engaging with Social Security. So that again is another agency that takes a lot of time to understand and navigate, because it has its own rules and processes.
And sometimes they're clear as mud.
Yes.
Yeah.
As is all of ours, right?
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And if I could take the time to highlight, what are some barriers that you see that affect our families and individuals in need of assistance, and really just keeping an eye, or utilizing an equity lens to ensure everyone is included? What are the common themes that you may see and resources to address those?
Well, I think one of the big barriers is financial. Folks with really good insurance and really good healthcare systems get better intervention. Schools that are wealthier have more to invest in special education. So I think that's one big barrier is for folks who are not wealthy. It can be very difficult to get funding for therapy. Ohio has the Bureau for Children with Medical Handicaps, or maybe it's got a new acronym now, in which you can, the state will pay for the diagnosis of a child with autism, but they don't pay for treatments once you get that diagnosis. So that would fall to the school district, that would fall to the board of DD. But I think that's one big barrier. Another is the isolation that accompanies the symptoms of autism. If you have trouble making social connections, you then don't have social connections, and so you don't have the social supports that you might need. If you have bad experiences, you may not go back out into the world. So that stereotype of sitting in your mother's basement playing video games, it has basis in reality. I think those are two of the real issues.
And I'll piggyback a little bit off the second one of that, like social isolation, right? Is sometimes families make connections in their communities, we call sideline connections, as your children go through youth sports and clubs and other socialization that you might miss out on if you're prioritizing therapy, early intervention, or you feel like you're a burden on the youth sports system in your community. And I would just say, find ways for your son or daughter to continue to be included in everything else their peers are doing, and then also trying to find those support groups to find families with other lived experience just like you, so you can connect. I know the Department of Developmental Disabilities has really intentionally focused on fathers recently and trying to bring dads together, because sometimes it does feel like a much more maternalistic approach and priority, but making sure that dads are involved in this conversation, that they know what they can and should be doing to support their child, and all the different support agencies that are coming their way, right? That it doesn't just rest on one caregiver, but that it's a shared responsibility, and then offering opportunities for them to connect together, and having dads connect on some of the isolation they may be experiencing or barriers. And then go ahead.
I was just going to say, there are a lot of opportunities that are offered for children and youth with disabilities, but organizations aren't out there by and large intentionally creating opportunities for adults to experience community. I just saw an ad for what looked like a wonderful concert that would be hands-on, talking to the musicians, but it was for ages 6 through 12. Now, my 32-year-old would have loved to go to that, but he's not within the age group. And Easter egg hunts in the at the rec center up through age 9. Well, you may have a 27-year-old who would love to sit on the Easter Bunny's lap, but it doesn't happen because I'm not entirely sure why it doesn't happen. We have intentionally opened almost 100% of our activities to all ages, but that's another barrier, is that idea that we need to provide those opportunities for children, but somehow adults don't need them anymore.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important to highlight, because autism is not something that you grow out of. So then where's the support once the child is graduated from high school, once they are an adult? Where do they go? Where do their families go? Because I can just imagine, as a parent and a spouse caring for this individual, also feeling upset and at a loss. Where do we turn to for the continued support? And you brought up a point earlier. It makes me think of understanding social cues. How many individuals, if you did see the 33-year-old individual sitting on the lap of a bunny, what does that look like? Well, why don't we start normalizing this conversation? So then there aren't the looks and inappropriate comments. And so it's like, how do we build those inclusive or, environments within our community? How do we provide the support? And I guess the question in it would be, what can we do, especially as adults and working in our work environments? How can we provide the support and be more understanding when we think something's unacceptable? It's like, oh my gosh, I need my personal space. What can we do?
Well, I think one of the things is that you deal with it head on, honestly, and kindly. Is can you John, you're in my personal space. Can you take a step? It's making me uncomfortable. Can you take a step back? That's very kind. And if you do it enough, it will become a habit. and instead of saying, "Ah, I just got to get out of here, I can't talk to him."
Mhm.
So, I think that really is, so if you recognize that it's not rudeness, it's not intentionally trying to be intimidating or make you uncomfortable, but that you have a role in teaching those social skills, in, letting that person know. And it's not even really being assertive. It's understanding that you can have a role in making that person's life bigger.
Mm. Yeah, and I think just an offshoot of that is just allowing folks to have an extra moment of grace, right? And I think we had a lot of that, I think, over the last couple of years, is understanding that not everyone's disability is visible, right? And you may, again, see someone on the spectrum that looks typical, but they certainly have their own challenges and barriers, and just, yeah, speaking very frankly and honestly with them, and then giving them grace to know that you may have to say it a few more times, or you may have to be repetitive with it. And, it may feel annoying to you to have to do that, but it is being helpful. And to Kathy's point, you're broadening their social circle and you're being part of their day. And I think understanding that if we could give everyone an extra moment of grace in order to just be patient and accommodating, I think that would go a long way in the workplace.
One example that came out in our adult social group was one of our young women was having trouble with some of her coworkers because they were offended that she emptied the waste baskets 3 times a day. She got her work done. It wasn't, but for her, getting up and emptying the waste baskets, it provided her with a little break, that she might need to refocus. Also, she didn't like the smell of their Starbucks cups, and that was impinging on there. And these other 3 women in the office were just going to the boss about, she's gold bricking, blah, blah, blah. And the boss talked to her and found, and he said, "What's your beef with this? I mean, how does this hurt you that she does this? She gets her work done. Lay off her." And I think, we have that remember high school and junior high school, where, that one person sort of picks at a weakness in somebody else, and all the other hens come in and start pecking at that chicken. And I think, be aware that happens and resist it.
And I think to just asking questions, like being inquisitive, like, is this okay that I do this? Is there a problem here? Like, is there something we could do better? I think just asking some probing questions would have probably cured that problem much quicker, much easier, and again, just made it a much more accommodating and inviting space for everybody. So yeah, I think it's okay to ask questions of people with disabilities or autism spectrum disorder, to be like, hey, is this okay? Are you comfortable if I do this? Or is this an okay way for me to work with you? Is it okay if I set up stuff over here? Should I use a different trash can? Is there a problem here? So I think a lot of times people want to sidestep things, but just being honest and open and accommodating and respectful, I think goes a really long way.
And also maybe giving the person with the autism the ability to, if they're upset or concerned about something, to give that to you in writing, rather than having to have that social. It could be helpful to some folks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That is so important. And I think the last question I would like to ask, as we close this amazing session out, we spoke about it earlier, there has been a movement from autism awareness to autism acceptance. Could you please highlight why that is important?
Well, I can be aware that you have autism And I can say, well, that makes it okay for me to discriminate against you or be mean to you or, fire you. If I accept that you have autism, then it puts more responsibility on me to treat you as a whole and important person. I always say I'd like to move on to Autism Action Month, which then, forces us to be even more purposeful. But I think it's a huge step from awareness to acceptance.
Yeah, I think the words of like neurodivergent, right? Just talking about we all have these these differences, and seeing that that colorful circle and reminding me of the DISC profile that a lot of organizations will sometimes do, right? And you might, as a manager, do that so you get to know your staff better. I think that is exactly what autism acceptance is, right? We know that folks are going to have talents and interests in certain areas, or have some needs or supports that they need in other areas, and it's okay. And that we're here to support them and accept them for who they are, and not try to make them anything different or reprogram them in any way. But we're really just trying to support them to be who they are and to be included in the conversation, the community, and then the workspace.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was the perfect way to wrap this up. I so appreciate both of you and your organizations for taking the time to highlight the important issues, and especially highlighting how we can help adults with autism and caregivers and loved ones. So thank you so much for joining us. We will be sure to follow up in the comments with these amazing resources, so please do check back. And I would like to say again, thank you. Everyone, please take care. And we look forward to seeing you for a future upcoming Lunch and Learn event.
Thank you so
Sandra.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.